Hello, fungi friends. I just received a physical copy of my book, Passport to Kingdom Fungi, and this is something that I've worked on for the past 3+ years. So it feels pretty amazing to actually hold this book in my hand. And I tried to the best of my ability to write a accessible, fun, interesting, fascinating overview of the fungal kingdom and tried to include as much as I possibly could, much to the chagrin of my publisher, because there's barely any empty spaces in the entire book because I was putting in photos and illustrations and text and just every imaginable tidbit I could to try to make this book as rich and as interesting and have as much sort of staying power as I possibly could. And I also used a lot of QR codes in the book. So every single time there's like a mushroom entry, there's also a QR code that will link you to iNaturalist with a bunch of information about that mushroom and like where you can find it in the world, and as well as a Wikipedia entry. So I thought I might kind of look through this a little bit with you guys and show you some of what's in the book. It's got a really nice cover. I called it Passport to Kingdom, Passport to Kingdom Fungi, because I wanted it to be people's like ticket to entry, the way that you would go into the fungal kingdom and start learning about stuff. So this is your passport, and even the texture of it sort of feels like a passport. It's really fun. The inside cover is a taxonomic table. So it's this whole lineup of how different fungi are related to each other across different families and genre, and all the way up to the phyla level. So that's a really cool resource to have in this book on the inside cover. The foreword was written by author Eugenia Bone, and I'm excited about that because Eugenia is one of my favorite authors, and she's also the person who kind of literally inspired me to follow my passion for fungi and start attending events and getting more involved in the mycology community. Eugenia Bone is also the person who introduced me to my agent, who helped me get my book deal. So I thought it was very apropos to have Eugenia write the foreword for my book. And she said some really nice things, and I'm very complimented by that. But here's the table of contents. So kind of overview is the 10 chapters that are sort of these question answer things is understanding our fungal friends. That's like the first chapter. There's fungal evolution and reproduction, fungal taxonomy, fungal ecology and lifestyles, mushroom foraging, macrophagy, the practice of eating mushrooms, fungal biochemistry, fungal intelligence, envisioning a fungal future, which is sort of like all the prospects and things we can do with fungi, ways they can help us, and then our responsibility to nature and conservation and what that looks like. So that's the first part of the book. Second part of the book is all about how to identify mushrooms, sort of a deep dive into mushroom morphology. Then I cover edible mushrooms, sort of easy, medium, hard. Toxic mushrooms like deadly, dangerous, and sort of like caution, beware. Functional fungi, so I include both medicinal mushrooms as well as entheogenic mushrooms. And then there's a bunch of non-mushroom fungi, so I talk about yeasts and rusts and smuts and chytrids. I go into a bunch of cool fungal phenomena like fairy rings and guttation and gravitropism, the way that mushrooms grow with gravity. And then I finish off a little bit on slime molds and microheterotrophs, which are plants that sort of parasitize, live on mycelium, get their carbon from fungi. So that's the way the book is organized. I guess I'll kind of leaf through here and just show you guys a couple pretty pictures and stuff as I go along. Here's a picture of parrot mushrooms and chicken of the woods. So parrot mushrooms were the first mushrooms that I remember seeing as a kid, and I was like dead convinced they were aliens because they're crazy, slimy little green mushrooms. And chicken of the woods was one of the first wild mushrooms that actually I guess it was the first sort of, my dad and I cultivated it because we plugged a stump in the yard, and then we harvested the chicken of the woods and ate it, and it was absolutely delicious, and that totally like keyed me into wanting to eat mushrooms the rest of my life. Here's some pictures of mushrooms that were really influential on me. They got me started learning about mushrooms when I was in New Zealand. So there's tawaka, or what's the name of it? It is Cyclocybe parasitica. It's kind of like a piapini mushroom. And there's the Favolosia calicera, which is the orange pork haunch. So these are both in New Zealand. This is an edible mushroom, and this is actually an invasive mushroom, which is now spreading here in California too. But those are two mushrooms that sort of inspired me to want to learn more about mushrooms. That's the intro. Here's a nice little figure on here's all the places that mushrooms show up in nature. They're in water, they're in the human skin and gut microbiome, they're inside the guts of ruminants. Of course, they're associated with decaying plant material and inside of trees and on tree roots, and associating with bugs and insects and viruses, and pretty much everything on the planet interacts with fungi in some way or another. They're a really essential part of the carbon and nitrogen cycle. That's what I'm showing here, as well as sort of all the little trophic understandings. Here's the basic 5 forms of fungi that I talk about in the book. So we have mushrooms, clearly, but there's also yeasts, single-celled fungi, lichens, which are like a symbiosis between fungi and algae, chytrids, which are little aquatic parasitoids, and molds. If you know what mold is, go look in your fridge. There's probably something that's moldy. Here's a good question I have, little bars through the book that say, are mushrooms from outer space? And the quick answer is no. They might look like they're from outer space. They might look totally weird and strange, but they are not from outer space. So, mushrooms evolved here on this planet, and a lot of their evolution went in parallel with plants. Plants did one thing, fungi did another thing, and they kind of went back and forth for many years. A little thing on prototaxides, which is what they talk about, the giant sort of club mushrooms that used to be the dominant, bigger than trees kind of thing. And we're pulling back a little bit on the hypothesis. It's been popularized a lot in media, but we don't actually have enough evidence to say that they were taller than trees, because we don't even know if they stood up straight. They might have been laying on the ground. So I, as much as I could in this book, tried to stick with the science and not interject my thoughts, feelings, and opinions on top of what the data actually said. I tried to read the papers, read the data, and give a good overview of what we actually know versus what we think we know. And to me, that was important, because I have a PhD in biochemistry, and being a scientist, being critical, and thinking realistically is important to me, and not getting sort of carried away through hyperbole and the stories that we tell ourselves. And there was a lot of things in this book where I was writing, and I was writing stuff that I'd been told or stuff that I'd heard, and I was asked, do you have a source for this? And I said, yeah, of course there's a source for this. So I dove into the literature, and as I'm going through it, I was like, it turns out there isn't a source for this thing I've heard repeated again and again in the mushroom community, but there's no actual source for it. It came from one of the big important mushroom people said it once, and then everyone took it as fact. Turns out it's not true, or maybe there's a more nuanced version of that. And I tried to put the more, nuanced versions into the book in a simple, understandable, relatable kind of way, while still citing the primary literature. And that wasn't easy to do. That was a lot of work involved in that, and I did my best. And so I hope you guys see that when you read the book. Here's kind of a little overview of taxonomy and the different kingdoms of life, and here's eukaryotes with fungi. And here's a nice big, really beautiful tree of life of fungi that's here in the book, along with a QR code to one that's in higher resolution. Here's a nice little blurb from Alan Rockefeller about how we define new species. If you guys are familiar with mycology, you've probably heard of Alan before. Sometimes we get accused of being doppelgangers. We are not the same person, but we do get along, and we're friends. I like Alan. He's a good dude. Here's a little breakdown of the different sort of fungal taxonomic categories, along with a breakdown in the text. Here's kind of overview table of all the different kinds of fungi out there and the relative lifestyles they live and how many of them there are. different like ecological guilds, as they call them, but different ways that like fungi live and eat. I was gonna do this on TikTok, but I went on TikTok for a second, and within like 5 minutes of being on there, I got restricted, and it really it killed me because I've spent like 7 years live streaming on TikTok and building an audience there, and like I literally can't go on without getting restricted after like 5 minutes when I'm just sitting there talking about fungi. So we're here doing this on YouTube, which is probably going to be where I'll live stream in the future, and hopefully we can curate a cool community and conversation here. So if you guys want to know anything, feel free to ask me comments or ask me questions in the comments. Here's a nice little overview of different kinds of mycorrhizae and like where they show up in terms of latitude on the planet and what kinds of habitats they're keyed into. Basically, like down on the equator and in agriculture, man-made landscapes, there tends to be a lot of arbuscular mycorrhizae, and that's also relatively common in deciduous forests that lose their leaves. As you get further up towards the poles, north and south, and there's more conifers and the soil gets poorer and colder, then you get more ectomycorrhizal fungi. And as you get towards like high altitude and really polar spaces, you get these sort of mossy bogs and stuff like that, and that's where ericoid mycorrhizae dominate. So, I don't know why I would be restricted. I just talk about mushrooms and fungi, and I'm an educator and I'm a PhD biochemist, but the way the reporting system works, people can report you for literally anything. And that's frustrating because I am an expert and I'm just talking about mushrooms and fungi and how they work. But, that's what it is. So here's a nice little map I have in the book of like distribution of different kinds of fungi across the globe and like kind of where there's hotspots. And that's based on data. And that was actually when I was talking about stuff that I'd sort of heard, and I had to actually go look up primary literature and find sources that supported what I was trying to say. Instead of just assuming that I knew something, I had to actually like go in and really look at data and make sense of those maps and understand the distribution of species based on the science and not just what my feelings were. So YouTube really wants me to stream vertically, want me to stream horizontally. So I'm doing it vertically, and that's how I've done most. So I'm going to keep doing it this way. Here is a really cool figure that I like about what's called the marketplace, marketplace economy, I guess, for mycelium. And you guys have probably heard the concept that mycelium is helping to share and coordinate resources underground. And there's the saying mycelium is like the internet of nature, which is a vast overstatement because there's a lot more competition going on between mycelium than people think. And there's been some really scathing reviews that have come out that sort of refute the idea that mycelium is the internet of nature. So I did my best in this book to try to present like the most recent science, as well as some like critical takes on what's actually happening underground. And so that figure is a good representation of what they call the marketplace economy. And this is basically the idea that like each tree in each mushroom has individual choices to make about who they want to associate with based on their needs and what they want. So I think that's kind of cool. I wasn't trying to just repeat what other people had done. I was trying to do something new that was going to have more value to the world than just repeating what other people had done and said. And again, using my critical eye as a scientist to help assess data and actually look at the facts instead of just repeating factoids that other people have kind of tossed out there. So speaking of which, here's a whole bunch of general rules about mycology that you hear all the time and all of their exceptions. Because to me, the only rule about mushrooms and fungi that is absolutely true is that every rule has an exception. And there's really almost nothing you can say about mushrooms and fungi that is universally true of everything, because there is always an exception, as I said. So, someone asked me, what is the most interesting fungus in your opinion? So, oh man, that's a difficult question because there's so many. To me, my sort of original fungal crush was yeast and fermentation, because I spent a lot of my life studying wine, studying beer, studying how alcohol is made. So to some degree, I still think that like yeast to me are some of the most interesting fungi. When it comes to mushrooms and the insane wild variety of how many different kinds of mushrooms there are, it's like really difficult to decide on just one. I will certainly say like morel mushrooms are one that people find very intriguing for a whole lot of reasons because they're tasty. They're very difficult, if not impossible, somewhat impossible to cultivate. There's a lot of misunderstanding about their ecology, their life cycle, their chemistry, even their toxicity versus their edibility. So I think morels are definitely one of the ones that has the most mystique around it, and I think is the one that people find very compelling, especially because they're delicious, so people want to find them. So I'm going to read a couple of the sort of general rules and then give you guys the exceptions here. So avoid eating all mushrooms with gills is common advice you hear from people about mushroom foraging, and I think that's dumb because, yeah, sure, there's lots of toxic mushrooms that have gills. There's a lot of toxic mushrooms that don't have gills. And there's also a lot of great edible mushrooms that have gills. So by like avoiding gilled mushrooms entirely, you're not really doing yourself any favors. You should just learn how to identify mushrooms better if you're afraid of gills. White-gilled mushrooms are deadly poisonous, and that's not true. There's plenty of gills. There are some white-gilled mushrooms that are toxic, but there's some white-gilled mushrooms that are edible. And so, again, exceptions. Mushrooms growing in grass are safe to eat. That is definitively not true. In fact, in North America, one of the most common mushrooms that grows in grass is Chlorophyllum molybdes, and that's the common name for that is called the vomiter because it makes you throw up a bunch. And so that is not a safe one to eat. And so don't follow the advice of mushrooms that grow in grass are safe. Boletes that stain blue are poisonous. That's not true. There's a lot of boletes that stain blue, and many of them are edible. There is one bolete that stains blue that is poisonous, and that's Rubroboletus. But, there's a lot of others that are blue staining that are perfectly edible. And importantly, blue staining boletes are also not active. Just because they stain blue doesn't mean that they contain active tryptamines. So that's another important note. What I hear a lot is if animals are eating a mushroom, then it's safe for you to eat. That is definitively not true. That's a very dangerous mindset to think that. We have fundamentally different biochemistry than animals, and just because you see a squirrel like eating a mushroom, you don't know that squirrel might not go off somewhere and keel over dead after eating that mushroom. It probably knows better, but I wouldn't trust my life to a squirrel. Also, we have fundamentally different metabolism than a squirrel, so maybe what a squirrel can eat, we can't eat, So if it's small and brown, throw it down, and that's generally good advice for mushrooms because there are a lot of small brown mushrooms that are toxic, particularly like Galerina. But you miss out on a bunch of great edible mushrooms that are like small brown mushrooms, like candy caps and the fairy ring mushroom, Marasmius auretes. So it's better to learn mushrooms one by one rather than just sort of assuming that you can follow these rules. There's also, the last one here is like all polypores that grow in wood are safe to eat. And that is very much not true because there is a toxic polypore called Hapalopilus, and it is a deadly toxic mushroom. So don't trust everything you hear when it comes to rules about mushrooms. And that's one of the main points I make in this book is that you should really, I hate the phrase do your own research because I really don't trust people these days to do their own research. But this book is something that can help you really learn and study a lot about fungi and mushrooms in a very metered way. I guess the idea is that I'm just trying to give you as much tools as information as possible and allow you to kind of learn about it all because it's been curated. You don't have to search around the internet and wonder about the sources because I have filtered all of this for you and organized it in a way that hopefully can help you learn it quickly. So here's a couple pictures of my friends. It's my buddy Sean, who's done a bunch of my YouTube videos. My friend Maria, who's an amazing forager. There's Gabrielle, chaotic forager. She's a big deal. My friend Jess, who's also an amazing forager and like wild crafter, chef kind of person. Here's some like nutritional facts on porcini, chanterelles, lion's mane. I've got like trace vitamins and protein and minerals and stuff like that. Got different cooking techniques for mushrooms and examples of that. a nice like, yeah, here's another infographic here of all the different ways you can like cook mushrooms. Here's an infographic on all different ways you can preserve mushrooms and, you know, dry them, make them into syrup, freeze them. You can, you know, lacto ferment them, all that kind of thing. Here's a great figure. This is one that the world has been arguing for years about mycelium versus fruiting body and what's better. So I decided to put some numbers to this. I'm a scientist, and I had a friend do a polysaccharide analysis on mycelium versus mushroom fruiting bodies. And all I'm trying to say is that they're different. It's a different composition of polysaccharides. And no one has ever published that before. But I have, and I will. I think that's kind of cool. Here's a little like thing on what to do if you suspect a case of mushroom poisoning, and a QR code there with a link where you can go, you know, get some help. Here's a little breakdown on different types of mycotoxins, which are pound for pound some of the most toxic things on the planet made by molds. And here's a whole guide to all the different kinds of toxins that are in mushrooms. There's a little thing on fungal intelligence and a little, like, illustration there of all the different ways that fungi exhibit intelligence. Here's a breakdown of the human microbiome and like all the different kinds of fungi that are on different tissues and places in our body. You know, the effects that fungi have in soil and in agriculture. This is a good one. I like this one. This is the mushroom circular economy and all the different ways that like mushrooms and fungi can be used to increase sustainability and help our soils and be used for medicines and enzymes and food and, you know, animal husbandry and turnover waste and all that kind of thing. So here's a nice cultivation guide. Someone earlier was asking something about cultivation. That was a very specific thing about their bags, and I don't have advice or thoughts on that because I don't do a lot of that kind of cultivation. I'm focused on foraging and education, and I do a little bit of like log cultivation out back, but not the kind of like cultivation that person was talking about. But here's a lot of options on different ways to cultivate mushrooms, along with, you know, guides and suggestions. Here's some stuff on, you know, global warming, deforestation, conservation of fungi. A little blurb from my friend Juliana Furci. And, you know, what are strategies you can use to inspire others to care about nature and biodiversity? A little like explanation on how to get your friends and family to care about the world around them. And hopefully using mushrooms as a way to do that. So here's a little guide on, you know, how to identify a mushroom, the steps you should follow. Here's a thing on, you know, how to take photos of mushrooms as well as how to make a spore print, and then a little bit on like spores and spore morphology, which I think is pretty neat. A little blurb from my friend Elsa about why spores are different colors and how mushrooms have evolved different types of spores. Here's a bit of stuff about the, you know, anatomy of a mushroom, and if you look up anatomy of a mushroom, you'll see this figure all over the place. But what I thought was cool is I got these illustrated as well, so I'm helping people understand both polypore morphology, gastroid morphology, and then like cups and also flask fungi, and how basidiomycetes and ascomycetes are sort of fundamentally different from each other. Here's a big like spotlight on mushroom morphology and like different types of language that's used to describe the ways mushrooms look, and then sort of 16 morphological categories that mushrooms will fall into. The name of my book is Passport to Kingdom Fungi, and it is available for pre-order on my website. It's not out yet, but it'll be released in April. This is an early print copy, and they only made a couple of these, and I got one. So it's fun to be able to look at this and talk about it. So here's another kind of quick guide to like how to differentiate fungi. I don't like dichotomous keys, but I do like this one because it can kind of quickly help you get to like what type of fungi morphologically would you be looking at if you follow a little bit of this logic. And then there's a big section here on just all the different kind of like families and classes as dictated by morphology. And remember, morphology can be different from their genetic background. So that's part of the taxonomic thing on the inside cover. so that you can compare both the morphology and the taxonomy, and because they don't always follow. Like, not everything that has teeth as mushrooms are related. Not everything that has gills are related. In fact, there can be things that have teeth and gills that are more related than things that look the same. So I think that's kind of wild. So you guys are talking about chestnut mushrooms are good for soups and stews. I really like Pholiota microspora, which is Namicos. Those are great for soups and stews because they have sort of a sliminess that thickens soups and stews. I'm not crazy about adiposa in a soup and stew. I use Lexinum a lot in my stews. That's a scaber stock, kind of bolete. Uh, yeah, I mean, I sort of prefer like slimier mushrooms in soups and stews because they help to thicken and they add some extra like body and weight. So Swillis is good in soups and stews. But I mean, I use literally any kind of mushroom in like a bean stew kind of thing. I use hedgehogs, black trumpets, yellow feet, chanterelles. Um, you can put anything you want into food and eat it. Mushrooms in general are very adaptable and go great with a lot of different kinds of food. So. Let's see. So here's just, here's breakdown of like different kinds of jelly fungi and stinkhorns. Here's some weird ones like the earth tongues up here and like the cordyceps and other kind of weird ascomycete fungi down there. Here's a breakdown of edible mushrooms. This is my ranking guide to edible mushrooms. So most books use some terminology like choice edible mushroom, and people are really confused by that because people who aren't mushroom people are like, what does choice mean? And even as a mushroom person, I'm like, what does choice edible mean? So I gave a 5-star system here because I think people inherently understand a 5-star rating system, right? 5 is great, 1 is not so great. And that's kind of what I called them. 5-star is an incredible edible. 4 is a great edible. 3 is a good edible. 2 is sort of fair, mediocre. And 1 is like non-toxic / technically edible. So when people ask about the edibility of a mushroom, it's not a binary yes or no. It's kind of like where does it fall on that scale of 5-star to 1-star? And then separate from that are like mushrooms that are potentially medicinal or like special preparation, because there's a lot of mushrooms that I wouldn't call a turkey tail edible. It's very wiry, very tough, but you can dry it out and then make tea out of it or like blend it and make a powder out of it and consume it as a medicine, but it's not edible. People aren't eating turkey tails because they have the texture of like wood, basically. Same with Ganoderma and a lot of other polypores. They're things that people consume for medicinal benefit, but not because they're edible. And so one of my least favorite phrases is when people quote Terry Pratchett, and I love Terry Pratchett, amazing author. I've been reading his books recently. But he said the phrase like all mushrooms are edible once, which is funny, except it's not funny because so many people repeat that without the knowledge of actually understanding that there's a lot of mushrooms you literally wouldn't be unable to eat. Also, that the dictionary definition of edible means suitable to be eaten. So if something is like really slimy or really hard or super tiny, that's not edible. You could put it on this like 5-star rating system and say, that's probably like a 1-star edible, which means it's not toxic. It's not going to kill you if you eat it, but it might not be good to eat, So I chose the 5-star system very intentionally as a way to try to change the narrative and the language around how we talk about edible mushrooms and what edibility is even defined as. So here's some stuff on cultivated mushrooms. We got like shiitake, king trumpets, wood ear, enoki. And one of the things I did in the book was I didn't have enough space in the book to write up too many mushrooms, but I put in these kind of honorable mention things where I put in like a photo and like a name of a mushroom. So there's the chestnut mushroom we were talking about earlier, along with Namicos. So those are both edible Pholiota species. And here's a bunch of other edible mushrooms that have been cultivated. And so I have the name of them in there, and you can go look up all the facts online, kind of thing. So. Someone was asking me about my favorite mushroom that I have collected. I have too many to choose just one favorite, but since I'm looking at it, maitake Hen of the Woods is one of my absolute favorites. Here's a picture of my mom with a maitake. So I fly back to Massachusetts, where I'm from, to pick maitake every fall, because we don't get it here in California, but I can go out to Massachusetts and get it there. The beefsteak mushroom is another one that's really cool. It looks like raw beef when you cut it. I love finding that. It's really neat. Cauliflower is definitely one of my favorites too. This is an incredible mushroom. So, lion's mane also, any hericium are absolutely delicious. You know, all these edible polypore mushrooms are some of my favorites. Got a little section on like king boletes here, seps, penny buns, whatever you want to call them. But what I like even more than king boletes is the butter boletes. And a lot of people don't know about these, but these are really incredible, delicious edible mushrooms. So, you know, part of my hope with this book is to get people to open their minds to all different kinds of mushrooms. So a lot of people sort of like know, like, oh, I know what a morel is, or I know what a chicken of the woods is. But this is really trying to get them to think more broadly and to consider other kinds of mushrooms and fungi that maybe they haven't thought about. There's a whole bunch of like nice little photo collage here of all the different kinds of like edible boletes. And I've eaten pretty much all of these, and they're not all a 5-star edible, but some of them are pretty good. That's kind of cool to just have that spread of stuff. So here's a page on chanterelles and like different kinds of chanterelles, and here's a page on like some of the lookalikes for chanterelles and things that people confuse with chanterelles. So good to see them side by side. Other easy to identify edible mushrooms are like, you know, yellow feet, black trumpets, and then there's hedgehogs and all the different delicious kinds of hedgehogs. Lobster mushrooms, puffballs, kind of shaggy manes. Here we get like honey mushrooms and what is that? Yeah, the oyster mushrooms. So I sort of graded them by how difficult they can be to identify. So easy, medium, hard section. So the advanced edible mushrooms are like, that has like truffles and matsutake and morels, because those are a little bit more complicated to forage for and you know, identify. I didn't exclude amanitas. A lot of mushroom books do not teach people about amanitas, and I decided to like put them in here and really try to get like the information good, because there are deadly toxic amanitas, but I think it's better to teach people about how to approach them safely than it is to not teach people about them at all. And I have gotten into endless discussions, spirited discussions on the internet with people about that, because a lot of people think it's irresponsible to teach people about amanitas, and I think it's irresponsible not to teach them about amanitas, because just generally like disregarding an entire family of fungi is both stupid, because someone out there is going to eat it, and teaching people about the edible kinds versus the toxic kinds is really important, because people end up eating the toxic kinds every year. There was just a news story about 3 people who ate death caps in California and got really sick and went to the hospital, and like, I don't know if they're going to survive or not. But they could have learned how to avoid eating those mushrooms if they had my book. So, stuff on matsutake, brittle gills, russula. Here's things on toxic mushrooms. So here's things about, you know, the death cap and the destroying angel mushrooms. These are the ones that are deadly toxic, along with some guidelines on how to like keep dogs safe around mushrooms. These are lorchells, or the things that people call false morels. There's a whole bunch of sort of like, you know, honorable mention section for other toxic mushrooms. You know, thing on jack-o'-lantern mushrooms and how they can, you know, glow under UV. I think that's pretty neat. Let's see. There's a little write-up on the fly agaric, Amanita muscaria. 2 write-ups on that, because one is here in the toxic mushroom section, and there's another one, the entheogenic mushroom section, which I'm getting to. Someone is asking about the kinds of mushrooms that can send you on a certain type of trip, and I do talk about those in the book. I can't talk about them here on social media. This is not allowed, but I was able to write about it in the book, and it's going to get published. So here's some more pictures of mushrooms that can be potentially toxic. Those are ones that aren't super high level of concern, but, you know, wouldn't want to eat them anyhow. So there's reishi, there's turkey tail. So those are like kind of classic, medicinal mushrooms people talk about all the time. I got chaga. Well, it's here lion's mane, and then here's chaga. And chaga is not technically a mushroom, but I actually do have a picture of what the chaga mushroom looks like, which is pretty cool because not many photos of that out in the world. So here's a section on entheogenic mushrooms. And I'm going to be kind of careful what I show you guys, but I mean, this is my section on psilocybe, and there's a lot of good photos from Alan Rockefeller here because he's the expert on that. And I had experts review this to make sure that I wasn't saying anything that was untrue. Here's the section on the fly agaric and different ways you can prepare and process it, and also some cool stuff on dye mushrooms and on different ways you can dye fabric with mushrooms. Here's some colorful mushrooms, and a lot of people assume colorful mushrooms are toxic, but more often than not, they're not. Colorful mushrooms are just colorful. They don't indicate toxicity. In fungi, at least, colors can indicate toxicity for animals and plants, but not for fungi. Fungi are just colorful. Speaking of which, here's a bunch of really cool, colorful cup fungi, and this is one of my favorite pages in the book. These are all my photos, and these are all non-toxic. Some of them are even edible. So I just think it's kind of neat that people have these assumptions that they make based on what we know about life, but when it comes to fungi, they're frequently incorrect. This is another one of my favorite pages. Lots of photos of stinkhorns and all the weird, rude-looking stinkhorns that are out there. Pretty funny. And there's a whole bunch of stuff on non-mushroom fungi. So earlier someone asked me about my favorite fungi. So Saccharomyces, brewer's yeast is certainly one of them. And all the cool things we do with yeast, from making beer to yellow wine to sourdough to other stuff. Foods that are processed by fungi, like cheese and wine and miso and sake. My friends Elena and Kevin run a cool place that they make all sorts of interesting misos down in San Francisco. And I have a little blurb from them and pictures of their process. We have stuff on different types of pathogenic fungi. So there's like rusts and smuts, which includes wheat lacoche, which is like traditional corn smut fungus that's eaten down in Mexico, and we could eat it here in the United States if we would stop spraying pesticides all over our cornfields, or antifungals. So there's a lot of cool stuff that I'm showing in this book, including here's fungi that infect insects, and then there's a question about is Last of Us feasible? Is it real? And all these cool pictures of cordyceps. And spoiler alert is no, Last of Us is not about to happen, and I think a lot of people seem very upset by that, but it's not feasible. The human immune system is too strong, and cordyceps aren't going to evolve quickly enough to evade the human immune system. Plus, just fundamentally, human physiology means that we're very different from insects. Insects are filled with kind of a liquid called hemolymph, which makes it easy for the mycelium to just grow all the way through the insect. Once they puncture the outer shell, they can just grow through this nutrient broth. Whereas human tissue is very different. We have lots of muscle and tissue and immune checks at every single thing. We are not just a bag of liquid for mycelium to grow through. So it makes it really hard for cordyceps to do sort of mind control in the way that they do to insects. And again, people will argue with that, but fundamentally, I'm correct and they're wrong. Yeah, I'm not gonna harp on that one, but I explain it in the book. Here's some cool stuff about the morphology of lichens and all the different ways that lichens can look, and lots of facts about lichens and what they are fundamentally, and quick little breakdown on different types of lichens. You'll see there's hundreds of thousands of different species of lichen, but I'm just trying to cover kind of the greatest hits in this book. And here's a bunch of stuff on fungal phenomenon. So I've got things on guttation and mushroom sweat, and just beautiful photos of all these different ways that mushrooms grow and things they do, including I've got bioluminescent mushrooms and gravitropism, showing them growing with gravity, even sclerotia, little kind of storage tubule things that mushrooms and fungi make, rare mushrooms, fluorescent mushrooms, mushrooms in unexpected places. This is one of my favorite things, is this mushroom aroma wheel and all the different smells that fungi and mushrooms can exhibit. ASCO for the different types of mushroom parasites, fungi that break down plastics. There's even fungi that can live like inside of rocks, called endoliths, which are really wild-looking things. And it ends with an overview of slime molds, which are not fungi, but are pretty cool looking. A bunch of my photos. And some stuff on microheterotrophic plants. So, the end is a big glossary and a bunch of resources, and this is a lot of work to put this together, but that's my book. I hope you guys like it. You can find Passport to Kingdom Fungi on my website, fascinatedbyfungi.com, or available at any major retailer. I would really appreciate it if you guys would pre-order a copy. It'll be out soon in April. Should be pretty cool. Also, for anyone who orders a pre-order copy, I will soon have a code to like an ebook where you can get early access to a bunch of the cool illustrations that are in the book. So, if you're interested, look up Passport to Kingdom Fungi. I'm so excited I can barely speak. By Dr. Gordon Walker. That's me. And hope you like it. I put a lot of work into it. So, cheers to you guys. I'll probably do more live streams here on YouTube because, like I said, TikTok is going away. That's generally where I've done my live streams. So hopefully we'll find a way to grow some community here and have some good conversations and discussions over the years. But D-glass, it was not rye that caused the stuff in, well, rye, so it's not rye rust, it's technically ergot, which is not a rust, it's a smut. And that's what was blamed for the Salem witch trials. Although that's been like somewhat debated over the years. And there's a lot of mushrooms out there that have really interesting aromas. Many of them do smell kind of earthy. That's a compound called octanol. The mushroom alcohols, these 8 compound alcohols. But there's mushrooms out there that smell like spicy and chemical. There's mushrooms that smell sweet, like candy caps. They smell like maple. There's mushrooms like stinkhorns that smell like dead bodies. So there's like a huge spectrum of different aromas you can get out of mushrooms. In fact, my friend Christian is about to teach a mushroom aroma class where we'll talk all about that. Chanterelles are known for smelling kind of fruity. And I talk about that in the book. So anyhow, I bid you guys adieu. I hope everyone has a good night. And thanks for hanging out with me on live and taking a look through my book, Passport to Kingdom Fungi. Please go ahead and pre-order yourself a copy. It's worth it. Adios, guys.